Hey everybody, Stu here with a quick note. The Skype recording quality for this particular episode was not terrific. Patty's a little bit blurry sometimes. The sound was yeah, rather choppy and pretty bad. So unfortunately, I can't edit everything out of it. You can't polish a potato, but I tried to do my best, and hopefully it doesn't detract too much from the episode. And with that, here it is. Thank you. Hi there, everybody. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty.
Hello, Sue. How are you doing tonight?
Not too bad. I won't
Good,
complain. Mhm.
good. So tonight I decided I was going to tell stories that have some connection to Thanksgiving. I know that we think of, ghost stories as Halloween stories, but in reality, the time period from the end of October through Christmas, traditionally in European and British culture, especially, was a time of ghostly stories. The nights are getting longer, people are settling in for the evening until the last 50 to 100 years. There wasn't a whole lot to do at night, so people told stories. So this became a very big component of family life, and I thought I would share a few, including one that I've actually written about in one of my books. And I was sort of surprised to find out, I don't know, I read the story multiple times, but it didn't stick with me that it had a Thanksgiving issue. And then I was working today on finding all the pieces, and I came across the story again, and I'm like, why didn't I think of that? So I'm anxious to get started. So the first story I was going to share is it's a classic teenager story. I don't know about you, but when I was about 14, 15 years old, going to relatives' houses became a bit of a chore. You're bored. Everybody asks you stupid questions like, so how do you like school? And oh boy, aren't you getting big? And
Yeah,
stuff
but
like
not big enough to sit at the adult table. You still got at the kiddie table.
that. So yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So that's
Huh?
that moment in time when you start wanting to pull away from your family a little bit and maybe do something else. And so this is the story of a young man who was in that moment. Every year for Christmas and Thanksgiving, he would have to go with his family to see grandma and grandpa, who lived on a little tiny farm in the middle of nowhere. And he used to love it, and he used to like to hear their stories. And now he's 15 and the stories are getting lame, and the questions are pretty lame, and he really has nobody his age to hang out with. So after the food is done, what are you supposed to do? So he decides that on this day he's going to go for a walk and kind of check out the place. He must have done it 1,000 times, but he was younger. He stayed with all the rules, and today is the day that he decides he's not going to stay with all the rules. And one of the biggest rules was don't go in the barn. There's an old barn out behind the house, and it's not safe. So nobody's used it for years and years um, because it's an old abandoned barn. There's no cattle, there's no any kind of livestock, there's no reason to be in the barn. So on this day, he excuses himself and says he's going to head to this little hollow down below the barn, and decides instead to veer over toward the barn. And he would talk about almost feeling a little compelled to go to the barn. And once he got close to it, it was creepy and old, and it was just beginning to get a little twilighty. And he knew he shouldn't probably go out in the woods. So something was kind of pushing him, though. So he decides to go in the barn. And he has a cell phone with a flashlight on it. So he flips on the little flashlight on that, steps in the barn, and he's looking around. It's cobwebs and a dusty old hay mow, bits and pieces of broken machinery scattered across the floor, tools hanging on the walls, most of which he probably didn't recognize. And he's just kind of walking around thinking, man, this is really creepy. Yep. And he stumbles and he bumps into this little table, and on it is a hatchet, and it's got blood on the hatchet. And he thinks, well, I remember my mom talking about it, and I remember my grandma saying that they used to kill chickens and stuff, for holiday meals and what have you. I bet that's what they did. They chopped the poor old thing's head off, and they just must have thrown the old hatchet in here after they were done, and that was that. Well, he almost turns around and goes back out, but something's just pulling on him to keep looking, keep exploring. And his attention for some reason gets drawn to the haymow. There's a ladder leaning against the wall that kind of leads you up into the haymow, and if you get up the ladder, you have to kind of make a sideways kind of step up onto the platform where the old hay is at. Anybody who's ever lived on a farm knows what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
I knew exactly what, I didn't live on one, but I had relatives who had farms. So, yeah.
Yeah, so and it's kind of a creepy feeling to be like hanging out there in the air as you're trying to get your right foot onto that platform so you don't fall. But he manages to get onto the platform, almost drops his flashlight, fumbles for it, and thinks, man, it is a long drop down. I better stay away from the edge. So he's poking around and he feels kind of compelled to go to this one corner, and he's poking in the hay and kind of looking around, and that's when he hits something hard. And he's like, what is that? And he pulls a little bit of the hay away from it, pulls his light up, and that's when he screams. And he almost literally runs off that platform and drops 2 stories down to the base of the barn, because what he saw was the skeletal remains of a person
Ooh.
sitting almost buried in the hay. And when he was fussing with the hay and moving his hands all through it, he uncovered part of this man. Well, he went tearing down the ladder, ran in the house, told his mom and dad and his grandparents, there's a dead guy in the barn. And they were like, don't make up stories. Like, no, there's a dead guy in the barn. So dad decides to go out and take a look, and grandpa decides we better call the police. Because obviously the kid's shaking, he's seen something. Well, dad comes back in and he says, oh my God, there is a man out in the barn. He's just a skeleton at this point. Police come, and eventually the family would come to know that this man was literally killed with a hatchet. There were hatchet marks on the bone. That they have no idea who he was or where he came from. And he was probably dead for about 3 to 4 years in the barn. And nobody went in the barn anymore because the old grandparents were too old to be climbing up hay mows and stuff like that. So nobody noticed, nobody knew. And Boy said that he honestly thought that this man saw his opportunity to possibly get found. And so the man kind of compelled him to go to the barn instead of going for the walk. Go in the barn and to go up to the hay mow and hopefully to find him and get peace and rest at last, and which is exactly what happened. And I just thought that was an interesting little story.
That was a rather nice story.
It is. I mean, not all stories have to be creepy. And like I said, I just have a few for tonight, so we're going to share them, and I thought that was a nice way to start. So the next story actually comes from Geneva, Ohio, and the story takes place in 1902, although the events occurred about 30 years earlier. So there was this southbound train on Thanksgiving Day going through Geneva, Ohio, and once you pass through the little town of Geneva, you come to what's known as the Marsh Bridge. It's just an old bridge with railroad tracks running across it. And on this particular afternoon, as the train is clattering down the railroad track, the engineer looks out and he sees what appears to be a white figure standing on the bridge. And immediately he yells, there's somebody on the bridge. Well, most people don't realize this, but one of the big things that railroaders have to worry about are suicides and people getting on the railroad tracks not realizing you can't stop a huge train on a dime. It takes a quarter to half a mile to stop one of those large trains. So, they keep a weather eye out for that, for anybody on the railroad tracks. And as they were coming close to the bridge, it's been known to happen many times that somebody will stand on a railroad bridge where they have no place else to go, and they'll commit suicide by getting hit. So he's looking out, just double checking. He sees this thing and he's pulling on the whistle. He's trying to slow down the train. He's yelling for some help. There's somebody on the tracks. I cannot imagine the fear. I can't imagine, because he knows he can't stop in time. It's just too close. And then these blood curdling screams come, and he can see the guy waving his hands, as if to frantically tell him to stop, stop. He's trying to stop. He just can't stop. And then the engineer's watching, the conductor's watching. They're all looking at this thing and they're thinking, we've got to stop this train. That they're doing everything humanly possible, but they just aren't able to. And the train barrels through this white figure still waving his arms. At that point, they finally get the train stopped on the other side, walk back over. They see nothing. There's no blood on the tracks. There's no body in the water, nothing. But still, as soon as they get to the next little town, they pull the train to a stop, go in and call the police and say, this is what we think happened. We need somebody to go out there and take a look. And so the police came and they took a look and they couldn't find anything. In fact, nothing ever was found. But some of the older guys who worked at that particular train station would remember something. There's a story, and it took place in 1873, where a train was leaving from Syracuse, New York, headed toward Rochester, and it ended up crossing Geneva, crossing that bridge. And what nobody knew was that that bridge had not been maintained well, and there had been a flash flood. And so the pilings, the kind of support the bridge, had been in the dirt, and everything had eroded away from them. And as the train got onto the railroad track on the bridge, it began to crumble the wooden frame structure of the bridge. And the first couple cars that held the engineer and the conductor went down over the bridge. And fortunately for everybody else, the train stopped. So there's two cars hanging down into the water, and the rest of the train's just sort of precariously sitting up on top of the track, which, there were a lot of people in that train. It was a passenger train. The two men, the engineer and the conductor, both would die in that accident, and their bodies were washed out of the train because, I said, they're dangling literally in the water. And it would be days later that they were found. Ever since that tragedy, people claim that they see a figure standing on the railroad tracks on the afternoon of Thanksgiving. He's dressed in white. He's waving his arms and yelling and screaming. They can hear the screams. They can never make out the words, as if to say, stop the train before it's too late. Now, the bodies of the two men would eventually be found. Ignatius Butte and Augustus Sipple were the two men. The families would end up suing the train company because they maintained that the bridge wasn't taken care of, and it wasn't. And perhaps that's one of the reasons these men are so restless, and whichever one of the men it is, if it is one of the two, he's been haunting on Thanksgiving Day ever since.
But I guess in the time since that accident, the bridge was repaired for it to be still in use.
Yeah. Yes. And to be honest with you, a lot of these old railroad bridges that aren't even in use, people still go out and walk them and what have you. I know I did growing up. My dad was a railroad brat, so on a Sunday afternoon, his idea of great fun was walking the tracks. So he would make us, go put on our sneakers, and we would tag along, and him and his brother would walk the tracks for like 5 or 6 miles, and we would tag along behind them. And, so I would imagine there's people that go out and just walk along that area. And maybe people ghost hunting as well. You never know, because, the story is apparently very well known in the region.
Well, and then anytime you tell a story about walking the tracks, I think about the walking the tracks with the man with no face.
Yes. Trains are different than a lot of occupations. when you're an engineer, I think probably the same for police officers, firefighters, truck drivers. You have a whole culture that goes with it. Like if you're an office worker, you're an office worker. There's nothing wrong with it. I work in an office every day, but there's no culture that goes with it. There's nobody writes songs to you. There's no mythology around it, but there is for these occupations. I'm not sure what the difference is, but there is a mythology around it. So, I think that that's part of the mystique of the whole thing. And people like to hear train stories. They love to hear ghost stories about trains. And there's entire books full with these kind of stories. But I personally am a train person, so I like that story. And I thought how appropriate that whoever he is, tries to reach out from the great beyond on Thanksgiving Day. And I could see people going out and waiting to see if he showed up.
Seems harmless enough to try. Yeah.
I would go out and see if he shows up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm that person.
I think I could even get Mrs. Stu to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be sitting there with a video camera and stills going and all kinds of crazy. Going, I'm going to get him this year. I'm going to get him this year. Yep, that would be me. So the next ghost story is actually takes place in Ohio, and it's a fascinating little story. This young man told me this story, and I thought I'd pass it on. When he was a teenager, he delivered newspapers, and anybody who ever delivered newspapers in a little town, that you know everybody, and they all know you. And if the paper doesn't land where they want it to, they're calling up the newspaper office or your mom and giving you grief. And he had that stuff happen to him too. But this is not about somebody who gave him grief. There was an older woman who lived on his delivery route, and her name was Maggie. And she was in her late 80s and religiously bought her newspaper. Well, because she was so old and she had a hard time going up and down the steps to get in and out of her house, the teenage boy began knocking on the door to deliver the paper, just because it would make life easier for her. And after a while, they kind of struck up a friendship. And so she would tell him, oh, I like to nap. So if I fall asleep, don't forget to just bring the paper in and lay it in the foyer. I'll get it whenever I wake up. So after a while, that's what he started to do. He would knock on the door. If Maggie didn't answer, she was usually sleeping on the couch or in a chair, and he would just go in and lay the paper down on the little stand beside her, and he'd leave. So on the as the holidays were approaching, it was getting cold, and he was trying to rush to get things done, but he's always took the time to do that for Maggie. So the first day of the Thanksgiving holiday, he did his delivery, and there were no deliveries the next day because it was Thanksgiving. So the third day he went and he did his delivery, and Maggie was sleeping. She was still asleep. He had found her asleep a day and a half earlier in the same chair, in the same clothes. Now he's really curious, but he's like, I know she wears the same outfit quite a long time because of having to do laundry. Maybe that's all it is. The fourth day, he came in to deliver the paper, and she was sitting up in her chair, and she said to him, oh, thank you so much. I appreciate everything you do. And she got up and she gave him a little hug, and she told him how he was such a nice young man, and and all of this. And he didn't think much of it because she was that kind of person and had those experiences before with her. So the next morning, the fifth morning, he went in, knocked on the door, and nobody answered. Went inside and saw her laying on the chair again, and she looks like she's sound asleep. So he goes in to lay the paper down, and he realizes she's really not moved at all since he saw her sat down the day before. So he touches her arm to just make sure she's okay, and she's cold and she's stiff. And then he sees the underside of her arm where the blood is pooled and made the skin dark, and he knows that's not right. Mm-hmm. So he takes off running, gets to the next house, and calls the police. When the police come, he tells them the whole story about how the day before Thanksgiving he dropped her paper off and she was sleeping, and the whole thing. And the police would eventually come to the conclusion she had died the night before he had dropped the paper off on Thanksgiving Eve. And he he couldn't believe him. He wouldn't believe him at first because he kept saying, "That's not possible. She gave me a hug. She was awake. I talked to her. That can't be when she died." But the police insisted that the forensics proved otherwise. And so, did he get a hug from a very grateful old lady who was now a ghost? Something that's bothered him a little bit for all these years.
Even if she was a ghost, you would think that, okay, all right, so even if you wouldn't be able to detect, all right, that I'm hugging a ghost, all right,
Right.
you'd have to look at the chair and see Maggie still sitting in the chair while you're hugging Maggie. So that seemed a little odd, other than Maggie would not be in the chair anymore.
Exactly.
Mhm.
How that worked, I'm not sure. But he was adamant that she was solid. She
Mhm.
was moving. He saw her stand up and gave him a hug and took the paper as though she were a living person. He never questioned it for a moment. And then when the police came and told him she had been dead for about 5.5, 6 days, he couldn't figure it out. And he still hasn't to this day, and he's wondered about it for all these years.
Curious, at any rate.
It is curious.
Mhm.
So the next story is called The Apology. And this took place in the early 1970s. So this young girl, she's about 17 years old, decides that on Thanksgiving she's not going to go to Thanksgiving dinner with her family. Instead, she's going to go meet up with a group of her friends. And they were probably not very good friends because they're doing drugs and drinking and carrying on. She wanted to be part of the in crowd. So she went to this one kid's house, and his family's all gone, and the music's loud, there's beer flowing, people are offering her, drugs and pot and what have you. She has been turning it down, but she suddenly got this really cold feeling, almost like she was in an ice box or a freezer of some sort. And she's sitting there kind of watching the whole thing, feeling like, I made a bad choice, man. I should not have come here. And she's just can't shake the cold. She's literally, shivering and chattering her teeth. It is so cold. And she said to somebody, "Oh my gosh, why is it so cold in here?" And they're like, "It's not cold in here. I'm breaking a sweat." And she can't explain it. So she decides to go upstairs and open a window and just sort of catch a little fresh air. Because frankly, she just doesn't want to fight her way through the crowd toward the door because people are coming in and it's just a rush. And she just doesn't want to be part of it. So she goes upstairs and she's sitting there, and again, the cold is just wrapped around her like a blanket. And she hears people downstairs calling for her. She's like, "Oh crap, I'll bet my parents found out where I went." She goes barreling down the stairs, and when she gets to the bottom of the steps, she comes face to face with a young man, probably 5, 6 years older than her. And he's standing there, and he says to her, "I know I did things I shouldn't have done, but I'm not a bad person. Will you tell them I'm sorry?" And she kind of backs up, and everybody else doesn't seem to see this guy. It's just her getting this vision. And she says, "Tell who?" And he's like, "My mom and my dad. Will you tell them I'm sorry? I didn't mean to do it." She would later come to realize that the previous owner of the house had a son who was in his early 20s who had OD'd on Thanksgiving Day.
Ooh.
And they went upstairs in the afternoon and found him. She believes to this day that the young man chose her to try to reach out to his family and let them know it wasn't willful. He's sorry for what he did and what he's put them through. And he can't seem to seek peace until he gets that apology delivered. And she has attempted to deliver the apology. But I thought it was an interesting story because we never know what we're going to encounter. She was trying to avoid family, and instead she ended up trying to help a family to heal a little, because obviously that would be a horrible tragedy to try to get past at any time, but the holidays just make it worse.
I find that interesting. I mean, on a tangent, that the ghost chose her, and that's why she was cold, obviously, because he was essentially surrounding her, perhaps.
Right.
But what is it about ghosts that they know that there are certain people that they're able to reach out to, and they seem to target them?
I think they can read the energy of these people because, I've had interesting experiences through the years. Like I remember being in Gettysburg and the spirit said to me, they told me that you would be here. And I'm like, me? And they said, yes, somebody who could hear us would be coming this weekend. And we were to talk to them. And I've kind of gotten to the place now where it doesn't shock me anymore when a spirit will say, I was waiting for you. Or, are you the person I've been waiting for? Because they seem to know, they can read the energy or something.
Still, that's also really interesting to me that they know who to seek out. That's so. I didn't mean to take away from your Thanksgiving story, but that's one of the things I thought of, as you were telling that.
No, not at all. It didn't take away at all. And it is true. I mean, it seems interesting that, certain people get chosen over and over and over again because spirit just simply knows that that person is not only able to see and hear them, but probably is willing to pass the messages on. Because you have to do more than, if seeing and hearing them won't be of any service to them if you don't follow through with that message, whatever it is. So, and I've seen stories where spirits have given information to help a family member who's really hurting, or they'll say, I need to talk to you because you need to tell my mom I'm okay. I did a case years ago. It was in Altoona area where a young man either committed suicide or he was playing Russian roulette and he ended up dying. His mother was so distraught because of her faith and because he was her only child that she was thinking of doing harm to herself. And when I went to do the reading for this family, kept showing me things like red birds and walking in the woods with snowfall and all of this. And I explained all of this to her, what I was seeing and the feeling it gave to me, which was one of great peace and joy. And she told me that he and her used to go walking in the woods and try to spot cardinals. It was kind of a game from the time he was a little boy up through till right before he passed away. And it would have been something I wouldn't have known how to guess, that would be his big thing. But the one thing that he did tell me that really seemed important, it's one of the reasons he was drawn to come in that day, is he wanted to tell her it was an accident. He left behind an infant son. And basically what happened is him and his buddies got drunk and they were being ridiculous and they were playing Russian roulette and it was an accident. Okay. It's just, it's one of those things. So this is my last one for tonight, but this is a story that I think is really fascinating. So there's was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Tripacan, and he lived in Malvern, Pennsylvania, down east. And every year at Thanksgiving, after the meal was done and the pie was carved and, up and everybody had it, they're so full they can't move. Grandpa Joe would sit down and tell the same ghost story every year. It was literally a family tradition. And this is the story. He said that he knew a man who claimed that he was walking from a tavern in the Malvern area in 1909. And he said, the man swore to me he saw blue and green ghost lights dancing above a trench in the woods outside of Malvern. And he saw figures climbing out of that trench, also blue and green. And they would dance along that ridge top there. And he said, I went out there and I sat there a couple times right near the holiday, the Thanksgiving holiday. And he said, I saw them with my own eyes. They were Irishmen and they were buried somewhere down in there because of the cholera epidemic. And he said, I'm telling you, no matter what anybody says, there's ghosts out there, the ghosts of those Irishmen. Well, the boys heard the story 1,000 times, as kids growing up. And years go by, and now one of them is a professor and one of them is a minister. They're twin brothers, but They're not identical. And Grandpa Joe dies. And what Grandpa Joe did for a living was he was an executive for the PRR. And when he dies, he leaves a lot of memorabilia behind, and a lot of notes and old journals and charts and stuff like this. Well, one of the two boys decides that he's going to take a look at all this stuff and sort it out. So his name was Frank. So Reverend Frank starts looking at all this stuff, and he says to his brother, "You got to take a look at what I found." And his brother's a historian, so he pulls all this stuff together and he starts reading it, and they come across this information that there was a group of Irish people who had come over, and it was 1832, and there was a cholera epidemic in the region. Supposedly, these people had built a little shanty down in that hollow there and were working for the railroad, and they died of cholera. That was the story. Well, the brothers decide that they're going to have to prove this. If it happened, it happened, and that they got some decent information now. So they decide to go down there and start digging, and they find some bones, and then a little clay pipe with an Irish shamrock on it. Definitely things that make it obvious that somebody's buried down there. So they call in a geophysicist, and he starts landscaping, mapping the ground, and he finds actual caskets. And they dig up some of it, and they call an anthropologist from Penn State. She examines some of the skulls they found, and in 4 of the skulls, she finds divots on the side of the skull, which suggests that the person was hit very, very hard enough to dent the bone. A death kind of blow.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of them, there was a bullet wound. So the bullet actually pierced the skull. And it's a very distinctive thing to see. These records have been held by the PRR for all these years quietly. Their grandfather Joe had taken them out of the PRR offices and taken them home and put them in his den, where the young men found them. Basically, what they pieced together is that this little area known as this little valley called Duffy's Cut, in 1832, a group of Irish people, men and women, and there were a couple small children, settled in that little area. They built a shanty shack, and they were working for the railroad, laying ties and what have you. Because they had the cholera, because they did find bodies that had no other markings, and it's believed they did have the cholera, the people in the nearby town didn't want anything to do with them. They forced them to stay out there in that valley. It is believed that someone, either a townsperson or somebody from the railroad, decided to take care of things and get rid of them so that there wouldn't be a problem. And they attacked them and murdered some of them. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that they found that actually could trace some of these people back to who they were, where they came from in Ireland, and everything. And yet the story continues on, because there's still 57, I believe, 57 bodies from that group of Irishmen that are known to be still missing. Maybe some of them got away. Maybe some of them are still buried out there. Here's what makes it really interesting. People are still to this day saying that they see the dancing lights. They look like men. They're red, like reddish orange like fire, blue or blue-green. They walk along that field at the top of that little cut known as Duffy's Cut. If they're seen at night. In fact, there's several people who claim to have seen them in recent years. Now, they were planning to continue to excavate that whole area and find all the bodies. They also know from some local journals and what have you that there was a blacksmith in the area who felt differently than the townspeople, and so he would take food out to these people and help them. When they died, he burned their bodies And then there's not much else you could do for cholera. So he burned the shack with some of their bodies in it. Others he buried that had died early on in the process. And all of this came from a Thanksgiving ghost story told for 30 years by Grandpap Joe. He knew literally where the bodies were buried, and his grandsons would make it all right.
That begs the question, why didn't Grandpa Joe do it himself instead of passing it on to the grandkids?
It's a good question, and I agree with you. There's no good answer to it. He was a railroad man. He was that through and through. He had to know if he said it that he would have lost his job and everything he had.
Or his
He
pension.
might not. Yeah, he might not have even, felt that the documents he had were enough to go on, because it took a lot of work. These guys started in the 90s, and it was the early 2000s until they had completely figured out the story. And a lot of legwork. I mean, it wasn't like everything was written out in easy to find ways. They found documents from a thing called the Sisters of Charity, which was a Catholic organization who had also brought food out. They found somebody had written in a local journal about knowing that, or suspecting, the blacksmith of taking food out to these people. There's a lot of stuff that went into the mix. So it was, if Grandpa just brought the documents out, I don't know if they were by themselves enough, and would the police or somebody have looked into it. But I honestly have thought that too. Why push the can down the road whenever these people need, they need to be given rest? And the belief is that because they were Catholic and because they were very devout people, that the fact that they were buried in unhallowed ground has kept them from crossing over. So the men were hoping to be able to find all the bodies and give them a burial. But Amtrak bought the rail line that ran through there, and since they bought that rail line, they will not allow anybody to excavate anything anymore.
Any idea why the different colors? Even a guess?
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, because I've thought about, like, will-o'-the-wisp lights, the swamp gas, that kind of stuff. But this far out, there wouldn't have been any decomposition left to create that. I don't know why they chose that. Maybe because in their culture in Ireland, because they came from Derry, Ireland, that they would talk about seeing pixies and spirits that were like fire, blue or orange fire dancing. That's a fairly common theme, that the ghosts appear that way. So maybe that's because they thought that's what they were supposed to look like. I don't honestly know, but there have been sightings. There have been people talking about seeing somebody walking across the field with an orange glow wrapped around them, stuff like that. So the story's still active in a lot of ways. It's a fascinating story. It's literally could be a novel. They went to Great Lakes to do this, to figure this out.
Yeah, I could see orange and green being the colors of the Irish flag, but not orange and blue.
But I just thought it was a fascinating story. I've written about it in one of my books, and the fact that they went to the trouble to do it, because I had a similar experience where I found an unknown Confederate dead soldier. It took 7 years to document that. So I know these men went to a lot of trouble.
And now you tell their tale.
Yeah. Now, they did put a memorial out there with the names of the ones they knew were there. They're hoping that will be enough to bring them some peace.
Hopefully.
Yeah. And with that, our Thanksgiving stories are over.
All right, so looking at the calendar on the day we're recording this, we still got about 2 weeks to go to our 1-year anniversary of the return of the Paranormalist podcast.
Yes.
So we thank everyone who is a subscriber. And if you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing on YouTube. Click that subscribe button, and they now moved it. It's now here and not there. And
okay.
click the little bell. Yeah, the font's changed and everything too, so YouTube's a bit different now. Consider clicking the bell so that you can be notified when we release new content. On Facebook, our group is the Paranormalist Podcast, and it's taken me almost a year to remember. You also have a group of your own on there, the Paranormal Asylum, which I cross-post over to as well.
Yes.
So we want to have people also look at the Paranormal Asylum if you get a chance. and our email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. And you can send us your stories, your ideas, your feedback, and we'd be very, very happy to hear it.
And wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving.
Oh, thanks. You have a great one too, Patty.
Thank you.